going above the average, the standard, the normal. Louis Giglio stated, God is not offended by your weakness unless you let it keep you from His strength. He's not offended by your weakness unless you let it keep you from His strength. Had not the woman poured out all her oil, those vessels would not be filled. Had not those people offered up their loaves and their fish, the thousands would not have been fed. If you hold back what you have to pour out, as little as it may seem to you, who knows the magnitude of what could be lost? God's power is greatest in our lack. When we fall short, He is the addition. He is the one that enables us to go beyond the standard requirement. Just as it says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, but He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. How good is that? His grace is sufficient for us, and His power is made perfect in our weakness. Pouring ourselves out unlocks the power to go above and beyond. But let me emphasize, you'll never experience it until you're at the end of yourself, until you give it your all.
Right.
The widow had one jar of oil left. Those people in the crowd only had a few loaves and a couple of fish. They could have kept it for themselves, but by giving it in faith, it was able to go so much further. If they had decided to hold on to what they had, they would have missed out entirely on the miracle God had waiting. But they gave to the need and were able to unlock the door to going above and beyond. So my question to you is, how will you respond to the need? Will you give it your all, or will you hold back? But before you answer that, I want to show you the bigger picture. I want to have a look now at the why. Why must we accelerate? Why must we go above and beyond? Why should we live a life where we constantly pour ourselves out? Are we okay so far, church? You getting it?
Yeah.
You're all so quiet. Okay, so moving on to the why. We talked about the how. We go above and beyond by pouring ourselves out so we have nothing left. Why should we do that? Number one, it's this. It's to uplift the next generation. To uplift the next generation. Let me explain to you what I mean by this. Notice in the story, the creditor wasn't after the woman. Who was the creditor after?
The sons.
Her sons. The creditor was after her sons. She says to Elisha, the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. What the enemy would much rather have and destroy is the future of your children and the future of the next generation, because it is through them that we live on. I believe the widow was in a more desperate situation because, yes, she was poor, but I believe that in her mind, her main concern was her children, her sons, and what was going to happen to them. And so to ensure to protect them, to ensure that they were not lost, to ensure that they had it better off than she did, I believe she had a mentality of whatever it takes. There was no hesitation to what Elisha asked her to do. She knew she needed to do something. Otherwise, her sons would be lost. She knew she had to protect them. She knew she had to fight for them. And she would do whatever it took to ensure that their future was secure. And the key to do that was to give, down to the very last drop, all that she was and all that she had left. And if I were to parallel that to us in the present time, there is a mandate on our lives to do what it takes to ensure that the next generation is not lost, to ensure that their future is secure. That we don't just look out for ourselves and our existence, but we ensure that when our time is over, the next generation has it better off than we did. And I want to explain what this looks like by sharing with you something that I've learned this year from Eric Johnson. And there's a quote, and I want to read it to you. He says, every generation has received a measure of revelation from God. Everything ever given to human beings by God, no matter how long for or for what purpose, was to be passed on as an inheritance to their descendants. And each of them obtained something that was supposed to be inherited by the following generation and then built upon, reaching new heights in humankind's journey with God. And so, as we pour out, we pass something on from one generation to another so that the next generation can build upon what is given. And to make this clear for you, I want to give you a visual analogy. So I have some props here. Who likes analogies? Can I please have 3 volunteers? Just 3 people. Dad, can you come up here? My dear father. I love my dad. Can I have 2 more people? Thank you, children. One more, please. Where's Greg? Can you come forward, please? Okay. Here you go, Greg. You can have the biggest one. Okay. Can we see them clearly? They each have 3 jugs. And they will each represent the different generations. So my dad will be the oldest generation. And Joseph in the middle. And then Greg can represent, like, kids' world. The younger generation. And so we understand, based on what I just read to you, that every generation receives a certain measure from God. And it is meant to be passed on. And so I'm going to play the role of the Lord, of God. And this generation, my dad's generation, is going to receive a certain amount. Okay? So they're up to there. Now his role now is to pour this out into the next generation. Support that.
Wow.
So that when this generation receives their fill, they're not starting from scratch. They're not starting from the bottom. But when they receive their fill, they're building on what they have received, and it goes higher.
That's awesome.
And now his role in this generation is to pour it out to the younger ones. To kids' world. So that when they receive their fill, it goes even higher. So they're not starting from the bottom. They're not starting from scratch. But they're building upon what they have received from the previous generation. So as they pour it out, it builds and goes further and further. Thank you very much. Give them a round of applause. But when one generation fails to fulfill their responsibility to pour out into the next generation, one generation has to reinvent the wheel and start from the bottom. And the time that they could have spent building upon what they received, they have to start from scratch. It's tragic. Eric Johnson describes it as tragic when each generation has to reinvent the wheel and discover for themselves something that they could already have received through inheritance. The time spent in rediscovery could have been spent building on what the previous generation left to inherit. And so we pour out because we're meant to uplift the next generation. If we go back to the story with the widow, after pouring out and after God multiplying what she had to offer, Elisha says, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." Her sons didn't have to start from scratch or live the same life, but they inherited something greater so that they could go further. And so from the younger generation speaking to the older generation, we gain so much from your wisdom.